Hello there and welcome to your game review and happy holidays as well. So we have this English opening and you play with e3 so after a few moves you mentioned you're not very comfortable with the position kind of here. You're not comfortable in such open positions, but keep in mind this was your choice to go here, right? You weren't forced to play like this. So over here e3 is not the only move, right? The main move is knight f3, castles. Then usually white plays with a3, b4, bishop goes to b2, rook c1, and we're kind of playing this reversed dragon, which is quite comfortable for white most of the time. So you could play that. Maybe that's more comfortable for you. So this was kind of your choice to play with f4 specifically, because even here, f4 is not the only move, right? The usual move is d4. This kind of makes more sense. It's not terribly good, but it's quite possible. We have this interesting type of IQP position, but white is doing quite well here, as black's pieces are not very well placed. So you could explore this as well, where your king is quite a bit safer than after f4. So you mentioned the opponent was playing all these moves instantly, which does show that he kind of memorized some lines, but this does not necessarily mean that he understands what he is doing, right? Nowadays, it's very easy to kind of know what move is correct, but in either case, the opening moves will not really make the result, right? So here, after d4, it is simply important to understand what both sides are aiming for. And what exactly white is aiming for is maybe a bit simpler than to understand what black is aiming for. White has the open f file, or semi-open f file. He also has the open c file, but it's clear that the f file is maybe more useful. White has the two pawns in the center against none, so white does have the potential to overrun black in the center if he gets careless. So it's kind of easier to play with white. The only question is how to develop the pieces. This is perhaps not very easy, but you solved this problem quite well with rook a2 to f2, as well as bishop b2. What black is supposed to do, I'm not very sure. It seems he should try to blockade on one of these squares before white gets to play e4 and d5, moves like this. So he plays queen d7, it makes sense to develop the queen, also stops g4, b3, and you mentioned you were struggling to find a concrete move here. But again, in the opening, we have three goals, right? Fight for the center, castle the king, develop pieces. Here, we have castle the king. The king is quite fine. The rook is developed as well. Center is fine. If we can play e4, then great. But as you calculated, after bishop g4, the pawn is gone, so we cannot do anything special in the center. So we are left with developing the pieces, the rook and the bishop. And it seems the bishop on d2 isn't terribly happy, but on b3 it's doing fine, or at least relatively, as there's no real better square for it. So b3 could be played rather quickly. And there's stuff like knight e4, knight e4 is also, I guess, possible, but it doesn't really change too much. I'm guaranteeing white should play b3 at some point anyway. So, okay, b3, a5, he made an instant move, but this is kind of an easy move to make because the b3 is kind of a hook for the a pawn. So this is quite standard nowadays, or g6, h4 on the other side. So this is kind of an easy move, kind of improving black's position slightly. Decided to not allow a4, which makes sense. Yeah, a3 is an interesting move, and you mentioned you were scared of this knight, but this knight on c4 isn't actually doing anything, and the interesting thing about it is this knight is dominating this bishop on c1, but at the same time this bishop is dominating this knight, if you think about it. And this rook can come out through a2 to f2, so the development is not really hindered. And this knight is not very stable, as b5 is not that easy to make. So a queen e2 will at some point kick it away. So the knight isn't terribly good here. It doesn't really prevent white from developing on the f file. Well, now the queen side is rather blocked. It's not clear what exactly black is going to do. Not to mention, there is this pawn here as well. So a4 is fine as well. Does give up the b4 square, but the knight on b4 is not terribly well placed. It could go to d5, but at the same time, it's not attacking d4 anymore, which means e4 is possible. So we're happy generally to get this move in. So okay, rook f8, bishop rook a2, so you found a way to develop the rook. Now bishop f6, but this doesn't really do much. It attacks d4. It has some kind of tactical points. Maybe it's at the moment threatening to win some pawns because of the knight on c3, but we can just continue with our plan, as now this will not be a check, right? It's still possible for black, and arguably he should do this to get some kind of dynamic play. He will get some material back, but white is of course doing well with all the pieces. So yeah, and also you mentioned knight fd5, I guess this is better. So knight c to d5 instead. Well, this is possible. Ancient says it's a mistake, or you say it's a mistake, but it's possible. Clearing up the f file, rook a to f2. So white has almost finished development. This bishop is quite well placed defending this pawn. At the moment, I guess this is small threat. For example, after this, we could consider going here, though I guess at the moment it's not really possible. Okay, bishop e6, knight f4. Maybe this gives up some of the advantage, mainly because black might be able to start blockading on these squares, as mentioned before. Because if he, after all, gets a blockade here and we're not able to ever push the pawns, and if he exchanges these bishops, we could imagine a scenario where we are left with this terrible bishop against a knight on one of these squares. So here, for example, after this, if we take back with the pawn, this would be quite instructively bad. After bishop d5, the bishops will be exchanged, the pieces will go to light squares, and this bishop is quite bad. We could take with the rook. This is not that easy for black, but after f6, bishop f7, rook a d8, it seems eventually he should be able to stop us from playing e4 in the long term and start blockading these squares. So instead, queen h5 makes sense to develop the pieces with tempo. And here there are some fine tactical points. If he takes, we will take here, of course. Importantly, he doesn't really have time to take here. If he could, and if he took here, then eventually he can again start blockading on these e4 and d5 squares. And we would be in trouble if our bishop never comes out. But importantly here, rook takes f7. So, of course, white is winning here. So after this, it seems black must lose time if he has to play something like h6. And clearly, queen h5 was a good move because we developed the queen with tempo. And if we can develop a piece with tempo or improve a piece with tempo without losing anything, we should do that. Okay, knight f4, he goes here. Now the queen goes to d3. Rook f8 is very passive. It seems he could have taken the chance to improve the knight. It's not really doing anything. After knight b4, mentioned queen c4. Now black can again start to try to blockade on these two squares. For example, after this, bishop e6. Let's say we move here. And after bishop d5, I guess it's not really possible. But knight d5 is even more to the point. This would also be a terrible scenario because this bishop is useless. So rook f8, but this allows white to make some progress. Queen b5. Now, kind of winning material. He takes here. And you mentioned this is maybe better. And here it is better because black is nowhere near blockading these squares. But it does make sense to take with the rook, as now he is, white is playing on the f file after all. And the g pawn going to the f4 square is not obviously very useful, at least not to my eyes. Not to mention here, black, to keep the game going, he must find the move knight b4. This is the only move, which is also not terribly obvious, but he must make it. Point being that if the pawn is taken, then I guess black has some compensation due to the pawn on b3, but this is also not terribly obvious. So black tries to gain counterplay against the king, getting off the bishop pair, but now a lot of pawns are dropping. So now rook takes f7. This is a very good move, and he gave credit to training about forcing moves, and indeed this is the point where we use our knowledge and our abilities. So a very nice move. At the end of this, white simplified into this position. We have now 2 pawns up. We could even take a third pawn, and probably this would be the most practical choice because when we are up material, we should think about how we are going to use our material. So the first step is to consolidate, and at this point it's white to move. You played queen f3, bring the queen back, but there's not really anything to defend from at this point. Black's pieces are quite passive, so we do have time to improve the position. So what I was saying was, when we have a pawn up, or a few pawns in this case, we should think of a plan of how to use this pawn to win the game. So what options do we have? Well, we could try to promote the e-pawn, but it doesn't seem very easy. It seems not very possible. Otherwise, where is the other pawn? Well, it's here. What can we do with it? Well, we can try to kind of create a passed pawn here, right? But all of this is quite difficult. But if we greedily take another pawn, now our plan becomes very simple. We can try to promote this pawn, which already seems quite possible, at least in the long term, especially against a knight, as knights hate pawns on the sides of the board. This would make the win kind of easier, especially since now Black doesn't really have any active moves. He could try to kind of invade with the queen, but at worst case, we can kind of just go back and try to defend passively and simply push the a pawn. Okay, queen f3, king g8, bishop a3, so you're kind of developing the pieces. But again, I would prefer trying to take this pawn, as it would make our job of winning the game slightly easier, because then our extra pawns would have a very clear purpose of winning by queen. But okay, this happens d5, so we're trying to promote this pawn. I guess this is kind of the correct plan at this point. c6. And here the move h4 was played, which is a very strange move because, well, what it achieves is it kind of blocks the move knight g5, which I guess could be scary in some situations. But if the knight goes here and the queen goes here, to make an actual threat, Black still needs to put the knight on f3, right, to give a check, or to attack, or to somehow take the pawn on e4, but all of this seems not very possible. So we could just continue with our plan. Also keep in mind, exchanging queens should clearly win the game. So something like queen d3 makes sense, also getting out of the knight's way. If here, then we should probably take with the queen. Taking with the pawn is fine as well. And again, if we take this pawn and we don't get attacked here, then we will be winning. Also, one idea is even to go with the king all the way over here, if it's necessary. Of course, we shouldn't go there on our own volition. After h4, the problem is now the g3 square is weakened, as well as the g4 square, and now at some point queen h3 could be also annoying. Okay, he takes queen a7, and also he finds this very nice idea of putting the queen on d4, which also is a big problem. So more or less h4 was a waste of time, which allowed all this. And you mentioned you thought you blundered, and you did. And indeed, the queen and knight combo could at some point start attacking your king, but you did not lose focus. d6 is the correct move. Now, if he takes, then you mentioned bishop to d6. Maybe queen c6 is more accurate, but something like this, at this point, it's not very clearly winning, but a position such as this is very difficult to defend for Black, so even though the engine says that this is equal, in human practice, this is not really defendable, as White can try to put the king on one square, the queen on another square, and Black will basically just have to hope that White does not make progress. So such positions are kind of winning for White in the long term, unless there's a perpetual right here and now, but it's not obvious that there will be. So instead knight e5 is played, he doesn't take for some reason. Now queen e2 is very accurate, gives a check, king g1, h5, so he is trying to use this square, which we have weakened. Moves such as h3 and king h2 would be quite useful at some point. But okay, bishop b2, knight g4, but this blunders queen c4, and from here, without the queens, winning with 2 pawns up is very easy, and you managed to do so. So this was quite an interesting strategic game, and you did outcalculate your opponent on several occasions here with all this. And again, if you're not comfortable with these positions, well, you don't have to play with f4, right? You can play with d4 or even without e3. So hopefully this was useful, and see you next time.